The great halls of medieval Europe still echo with the whispers of secrets too dangerous to be recorded on parchment. Behind stone walls, beneath painted ceilings of saints and angels, kings and queens were not only rulers of armies and keepers of crowns, they were masters of the most intimate weapon in the human arsenal: sex. In the shadow of the cross and the sword, desire became a currency, lust a tool of diplomacy, and forbidden pleasures the hidden foundation upon which kingdoms rose and fell. Imagine the flicker of torchlight casting long shadows across a cold chamber. A queen in a jeweled headdress lowers her eyes, concealing both calculation and temptation. A king, cloaked in velvet and fur, gestures for silence as he listens to the counsel of his mistress, whose influence rivals that of his most trusted knights. These were not private indulgences. They were strategies, power plays concealed in the sheets of royal beds, acts of flesh that reshaped the fate of nations. To understand medieval history without acknowledging this is to stare at a tapestry with its darkest threads missing. For in this world of feudal loyalty and divine right, where priests thundered against sin from pulpits and chroniclers etched morality into chronicles, the truth of power was far more carnal. Sex was bargaining chip and blackmail. It was the whisper in a lover's ear that could tip the scales of war. It was how queens secured heirs, how kings bound enemies into submission, and how courtiers clawed their way into influence. Some of these practices were whispered as scandal, others were cloaked in ceremony, but all of them shared the same essence: the body as a weapon, the bed as a battlefield. Consider Eleanor of Aquitaine, a queen whose beauty was rivaled only by her cunning. She wielded her allure not as a mere ornament, but as a weapon sharper than steel. Married first to Louis VII of France, she later divorced him and married Henry II of England, dragging her vast lands into his hands and forever altering the map of Europe. Chroniclers hinted at her rumored liaisons, stories of seductive power whispered in abbeys and courts alike. Whether true or not, the mere rumor of her supposed indiscretions became enough to terrify men and tarnish her name, proving that in the medieval imagination, a woman's body was a kingdom's most dangerous secret. But queens were not the only ones. Kings too harnessed sex to assert dominance. Henry III of England fathered more than 20 illegitimate children, scattering them across noble houses like pawns. Each child was not just a bastard, but a potential link in a network of loyalty, a way to bind barons and lords closer to his throne. His bed became a political workshop, and every liaison served to extend his reach. For the king, sexual conquest was not shame. It was a proclamation of virility, a demonstration that the crown was both potent and divine. In the dim corridors of medieval palaces, mistresses held sway like shadow queens. Behind the facade of royal marriages, often cold, loveless, and politically arranged, lay a parallel world of passion and influence. Agnes Sorel, mistress of Charles VII of France, was said to have convinced the king to reclaim his throne and drive out the English. She walked openly at court, draped in gowns that exposed her breasts in defiance of churchly chastity, a scandal to priests and a fascination to nobles. Her body was not merely desired. It became a symbol of power itself, proof that intimacy could inspire armies and alter dynasties. Yet the church never ceased its condemnation. From cathedral pulpits, priests thundered against fornication and adultery, denouncing royal beds as dens of sin. And still, behind monastery doors, abbots and bishops engaged in the very practices they condemned. Papal courts in Rome whispered of orgies, concubines, and illegitimate heirs, born from men who claimed to represent Christ. The hypocrisy was not lost on kings, who learned quickly that desire could expose a priest, a bishop, even a pope. Sexual sin became the silent lever by which crowns bent the mitre to their will. But nowhere was sex more dangerous than in the fragile politics of succession. A queen's fertility was not a private matter. It was the future of the realm. Queens were monitored, gossiped about, accused of infidelity if a child bore the wrong features. Rumors of bastardy could spark wars, as in the case of Edward II of England, whose close relationship with his favorites Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despencer inspired whispers that he had neglected his queen, Isabella of France. Her eventual rebellion and her rumored intimacy with Roger Mortimer toppled Edward from his throne. Was it a marriage broken by politics, or was it proof that in medieval Europe the queen's body could be turned against the king himself? And then there were the darker whispers, the forbidden practices never written openly but passed as rumor from mouth to ear. Incest accusations shadowed dynasties, from the Habsburgs to the Capetians. Poison was said to be slipped into cups by discarded lovers. Queens were accused of sorcery, using aphrodisiacs and love potions to ensnare kings, their beauty entwined with witchcraft in the fearful imagination of the medieval mind. Whether true or fabricated by enemies, these tales reveal a world where sexuality was both feared and desired, a realm where sin and sanctity blurred in the name of power. Imagine the wedding bed as a stage where two bodies united not out of love, but out of obligation to crown and country. The act itself was often witnessed or confirmed by attendants to ensure legitimacy, turning the most intimate act into a political performance. This was not romance, it was governance. For the king's seed was the future of the realm, and the queen's womb the vessel of stability. And if either faltered, scandal would erupt, whispered in tapestries and carried in hushed tones through castle corridors. In this atmosphere, sex was never just sex. It was covenant and corruption, loyalty and betrayal. Kings collected mistresses like knights collected swords. Queens learned to cloak desire in diplomacy, their bodies both weapon and shield. Nobles risked everything in illicit affairs, sometimes rising through influence, sometimes dragged to the scaffold in disgrace. The chronicles of the Middle Ages record wars, treaties and coronations, but hidden beneath are stories too dangerous to inscribe fully. Stories of a knight's passion that determined a treaty, of a whispered confession in the dark that sealed an alliance, of a royal affair that sparked rebellion. The bodies of kings and queens were not merely mortal, they were instruments of empire, vessels of lust and ambition, symbols of divine and forbidden power alike. And so, when we look back at the medieval world, we must strip away the gilded image of chivalry and sanctity. We must enter the dark chambers, where tapestries muffled moans and schemes, where beds bore not only bodies but the weight of kingdoms. For in that darkness lies the unspoken truth. The Middle Ages were ruled not only by the sword and the cross, but by the silent, forbidden power of desire. The story deepens, for each royal affair left shadows that rippled across generations, shaping dynasties in ways the chroniclers dared only to hint at. And it is in those shadows that the true history of medieval sex and power begins to reveal itself. Very well, let us step further into those shadows, where the torchlight fades and the chronicles grow silent, where rumor and reality entwine until they are indistinguishable. For in the medieval world, the bedchamber was often more dangerous than the battlefield, and the consequences of passion could outlast even the strongest fortress walls. One of the most notorious tales comes from the court of Philip IV of France, remembered as Philip the Fair. His reign was marked not only by political maneuvering, but by one of the most scandalous affairs in European history, the infamous Tour de Nesle affair. His 3 daughters-in-law were accused of adultery with 2 Norman knights, discovered allegedly through a gift of embroidered purses that betrayed their liaisons. When exposed, the knights were flayed alive, their broken bodies dragged through the streets as warnings. The princesses themselves were imprisoned, their reputations forever destroyed. Whether the charges were true or concocted, the impact was devastating. Succession lines tainted, alliances fractured, and whispers of female lust turned into weapons that undermined an entire dynasty. From this scandal, chroniclers trace the so-called Curse of the Capets, a legacy of downfall that haunted French kings for generations. Scandal was not confined to France. Across the Channel in England, the Plantagenet kings tangled their lineage with mistresses and lovers whose names still surface in courtly rumor. Edward IV, tall and striking, was known as a king who wielded his charm as ruthlessly as his sword. His passion for Elizabeth Woodville, a widow of minor nobility, scandalized the nobility, and led to a secret marriage that shook the foundations of his court. Many believed Elizabeth had ensnared him with witchcraft, her sudden rise from obscurity too unnatural to be explained by love alone. In truth, it was her beauty and cunning that gave her power, and through her, her family rose to unprecedented influence. The court resented her, whispered against her, but none could deny that her hold over the king was absolute. Here again we see sex wielded as political sorcery, an enchantment that could reorder the hierarchy of the realm. The queens of medieval Spain were no strangers to this game either. Isabella of Castile, remembered as a warrior queen and champion of faith, also knew the delicate balance between intimacy and power. Though her marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon was one of partnership and strategy, the bond between them was not devoid of suspicion. Their union, which forged the foundation of modern Spain, was bound as much by bed as by battlefield. Chroniclers observed their closeness with unease, for too much affection was seen as weakness, while too little was grounds for scandal. In truth, their marriage became one of the rare medieval examples where sexual loyalty translated into political stability, and it was precisely this unusual balance that made their reign so enduring. But in other courts, desire turned deadly. The court of Naples in the late Middle Ages was infamous for its decadence, whispered as a place where incest, adultery, and poison flowed as freely as wine. Joanna I of Naples was accused by her enemies of strangling her husband in her own bed, a crime that may have been political murder, wrapped in sexual betrayal. Chroniclers hostile to her painted her as a femme fatale, consumed by lust and ambition, though much of this may have been propaganda meant to discredit a woman who dared rule in her own right. Whether truth or slander, the story reveals how sex was weaponized not only in practice but in narrative. How a woman's intimacy could be reshaped into the image of sin to destroy her legacy. Sex was not merely an affair of passion, but an affair of state. Consider the ritual of bedding ceremonies in royal marriages, where noble witnesses escorted bride and groom to their chamber, sometimes remaining until the couple lay together. These acts were not private. They were performances, staged proof that the union was consummated and the alliance sealed. The queen's blush, the king's pride, the whispered prayers as garments fell. This was politics at its most intimate, binding two houses not through parchment or seal, but through flesh. The act of sex was made a spectacle, sanctified by necessity, and stripped of the privacy we today assume as natural. And then, in the darker corners of the medieval imagination, lurked the fear of seduction tied to sorcery. Women who gained influence over kings were often accused of witchcraft. Love potions brewed in secret, charms whispered into ears, talismans hidden beneath sheets, all were believed to give women unnatural power over men. In times of crisis, these accusations erupted into trials and executions, for nothing terrified the medieval mind more than the thought of a ruler bewitched by lust. Queens and mistresses alike were demonized, their beauty described as enchantment, their intimacy reimagined as heresy. It was easier to believe that kings were ensnared by spells than to admit that passion and weakness lay within their own flesh. But it was not only women who suffered. Men too were destroyed by desire. Piers Gaveston, beloved companion of Edward II of England, rose from minor nobility to heights of influence through his closeness to the king. Chroniclers hinted at unnatural intimacy, portraying Gaveston as a corrupter of the monarch's body and mind. Whether their relationship was sexual or merely one of intense affection, the perception was enough. Barons grew enraged at his influence, and in the end, Gaveston was hunted down and executed. Edward's grief was profound, but it changed nothing. His bed had betrayed him, his passion had undermined his crown. Through these stories we see that medieval sex was never free of consequence. It was a tool, a curse, a source of both creation and destruction. It elevated mistresses to queens in all but name, cast queens into dungeons, and gave bastards the power to inherit kingdoms. It blurred the line between politics and intimacy, forcing kings and queens to wield their own bodies, and the bodies of others, as instruments of statecraft. And yet, behind all the scandal and sin, there was also something deeply human. For beneath crowns and robes, beneath the burden of divine right and royal duty, kings and queens were flesh and blood. They desired, they feared, they succumbed to temptation. Their mistakes were recorded as history, their passions transformed into curses and legends. But at their core, they were human beings trying to balance desire with duty, caught in a world where every kiss could be betrayal, and every embrace could change the fate of empires. As we peel back the veil of sanctity, as we step further into the chambers where chronicles dared not tread, we uncover not just the politics of sex, but the haunting truth. The medieval world was ruled as much by desire as by decree, and though stone castles crumble and thrones vanish, the echoes of those whispered moans and midnight betrayals still linger in history's dark corners, waiting to be heard. Then let us draw the final curtain across these shadowed chambers, tracing the last threads of lust and power that bound the medieval world together. For if we are to wrap this tale in its full haunting shape, we must return to where we began. The realization that sex was not a distraction from rule, but its hidden foundation, woven as tightly into the fabric of the Middle Ages as war, famine, or faith. Consider the dynastic struggles of late medieval Europe. When legitimacy became a weapon sharper than any blade, bastards, those living testaments to royal indiscretion, walked a fine line between disgrace and influence. Some were cast aside, condemned to monasteries or obscurity. Others, however, were elevated, their very existence used to secure alliances and anchor fragile thrones. William the Conqueror, scornfully called William the Bastard in his youth, proved that illegitimacy could be transformed into destiny. His conquest of England carried with it a subtle but undeniable message, that the stigma of birth mattered less than the power of ambition. His triumph redefined what it meant to be legitimate, showing how sex, even in scandal, could alter the fate of kingdoms. And still, the power of queens remained both sacred and suspect. They were vessels of dynastic continuity, but also lightning rods for suspicion. When Anne Boleyn rose centuries later, she inherited this long medieval tradition. A woman accused of seducing a king, blamed with witchcraft, ultimately destroyed when her intimacy threatened the crown's stability. Though technically part of the early modern era, her fate was the culmination of a medieval pattern. The woman who enthralled a king became a danger to the kingdom itself, her body both throne and scaffold. In every whispered accusation against queens of earlier centuries, we hear the prelude to Anne's fall. Nor should we forget the role of the Church, which condemned sexual sin while secretly entangling itself in its snares. Popes fathered children, cardinals kept mistresses, abbots hoarded lovers in cloisters meant for celibacy. Kings knew this and they exploited it. A confession overheard, a scandal buried, a bishop compromised, all became levers of influence. What was preached from pulpits was seldom practiced in chambers, and in this hypocrisy lay a silent contract. Rulers would tolerate the Church's failings, so long as the Church turned a blind eye to theirs. Thus sex became not only a private indulgence but a mutual shield of corruption, uniting throne and altar in a web of shared silence. In the folk imagination, these scandals became stories told by firelight, tales of queens who bewitched kings with potions, of knights undone by their own lust, of kings who sowed their kingdoms with bastards like seeds across the fields. Some of these stories were true, others pure invention, but all of them reveal what people feared most, that their rulers were not governed by divine wisdom, but by the same desires that plagued common men and women. And in that fear lay both fascination and anger. For if a kingdom's fate could turn on a single knight's passion, then no law, no prayer, no sword could truly guarantee stability. The medieval age, for all its castles and cathedrals, was built on fragile foundations. Alliances were sealed in bedchambers, wars ignited by rumors of infidelity, dynasties toppled by whispered accusations of lust. The power of kings and queens was never absolute, for it was always vulnerable to the most intimate betrayals. Their crowns glittered with jewels, but it was often the hidden struggles beneath sheets of linen and velvet that determined whether those crowns would endure. And so, as we step out of those torchlit halls and close the heavy doors of royal chambers, the truth lingers like incense in a forgotten chapel. Sex was not an indulgence, but a force of governance. It was weapon and weakness, blessing and curse, sacrament and sin. The Middle Ages were ruled by men and women of flesh, not marble, and their flesh was as much a battlefield as any field of war. To study their reigns without acknowledging this truth is to gaze upon a tapestry torn in half. For the missing threads are these: the queen whose rumored affair toppled a king, the bastard who claimed a throne, the mistress who turned the tide of war, the king whose passions exposed his weakness. These are not footnotes but the very heartbeat of medieval history, pulsing beneath its gilded surface. And if the echoes of these forbidden practices still unsettle us, if the stories of lust and power seem too raw, too human, too shameful, it is because they are the most honest. They remind us that history was never shaped by ideals alone, but by desire. That behind every crown was a body, and within every body a hunger. And it is in that hunger, denied in chronicles but alive in whispers, that the true power of the Middle Ages resided. Thus ends the tale of how kings and queens of the medieval world used sex as their most intimate form of rule. A tale not of romance, but of shadows, where kingdoms rose and crumbled on the trembling edge of desire.